Liam's workday in El Paso, Texas, had just begun when he received a long-awaited but ill-timed call. It was December 21st, 2022. As soon as the call ended, he looked at his co-worker, Isaac, and said, "I have to go. Maggie and Barbara need me." Isaac understood immediately. It was as if everyone had been expecting this call to come sooner or later. He simply nodded and replied, "Don't worry, Liam. Carlos and I will handle things here. Take as much time as you need." Liam climbed into his 1998 Ford Bronco and began the long road trip back to the town where he was born and raised, Buffalo, Wyoming. He had at least 7 hours of driving ahead, plenty of time to think. The first thought that struck him was that it had been nearly 10 years since he'd last been home. His sister Barbara still lived there with their mother Maggie. In fact, Barbara had been the one caring for her. Over the past few years, their mother's physical and mental health had declined, not unusual for an 82-year-old woman. But beyond his mother's health, Liam was worried about Barbara, who had struggled with drug and alcohol problems her whole life. The call he had received was from the Northern Wyoming Mental Health Center. His sister had voluntarily checked into rehab after a neighbor found her disoriented on her front porch. Now, Liam had to take care of his mother, who had been temporarily placed in a nursing home until someone could bring her home. Liam had left Buffalo years ago for a job opportunity. He started a company providing electrical maintenance services to prisons and correctional facilities across the United States. The job required constant travel, which had distanced him from his family. Still, he earned enough to support himself, his sister, and their mother. Barbara only needed to stay sober, but Liam knew all too well how hard it was to remain tied to Buffalo. It was 11 a.m. when Liam merged onto I-25. Christmas music played on the radio. Lately, he had been so focused on work that he'd almost forgotten about the holidays. Less than a month ago, he had celebrated Thanksgiving with his co-workers, and now Christmas was only a few days away. This situation would likely force him to spend the holidays in a way he hadn't in years. His fast-paced work life had kept him isolated. He was a workhorse who never stopped. He remembered little from his childhood, playing in the streets with neighbors, setting off fireworks, going to school. It had been a long time since he'd thought about those days. The absence of his father had thrown their lives into chaos. He had abandoned them when Liam and Barbara were very young. Although they never lacked the basics, they had to endure their mother's struggles with alcoholism and the domestic violence inflicted by men who sought to exploit her vulnerability. One memory that never left Liam's mind was from when he was 11 years old. His mother came home drunk with a man Liam had only seen once before. He was sitting in the living room with his sister, watching TV. His mother and the man went straight to her bedroom, ignoring their presence. Liam and Barbara had been through this before, so they tried to ignore what was happening. But suddenly, everything turned violent. Shouting and the sounds of a struggle erupted from the upstairs bedroom. Liam became overwhelmed with anxiety and ran to his room, leaving Barbara behind. In his darkened room, he covered his ears with his hands to block out the noise. Eventually, things would quiet down, or so he hoped. But then he heard a voice in his head, calm and familiar. It was his mother's voice, speaking to him slowly and steadily. She was asking him to go to the kitchen, grab a knife, and stab the man who was attacking her. Liam stood frozen in the middle of his room, eyes closed, confused about where his mother's voice was coming from. When he opened his eyes, he was still alone in the room. Removing his hands from his ears, he heard the voice again. "Come on, Liam, help me, get the knife." Her tone was unsettlingly calm. Then, as he looked around the room, his eyes fell upon something watching him. Two enormous, unblinking eyes. He couldn't see a mouth and wasn't sure if this thing was the source of the voice. Liam stood silently as the creature began to emerge from the darkest corner of the room. Its body was emaciated and small, and it crawled on all fours along the walls. Its face remained fixed on Liam, even as its body moved. Liam, paralyzed with fear, watched as the creature slowly crept closer. Then, without warning, it leaped onto him. Liam lost consciousness and woke up the next morning, tucked into his bed. Without a doubt, it was one of the strangest experiences of his childhood. He never fully understood whether what he had experienced was real or just a nightmare. There were reasons Liam had stayed away from Buffalo. Until that moment, he had only thought about work as the main reason. But the truth was, his childhood was filled with dark moments. He had undergone psychological treatment several times because of his imaginary friend who frequently spoke to him. The voice often asked him to do things, usually involving harm or even killing someone. These episodes lasted only a few months before Liam realized it was better not to talk about his imaginary friend, whom he later called the Shadow Man. Over time, the creature seemed to grow, just as he did. Halfway through his trip, Liam decided it was time to stop, stretch his legs, eat something, and recharge a bit. He was in Cheyenne, Wyoming's capital. He pulled into the first gas station he came across. While filling up his tank, he called Isaac, who assured him everything was under control at work. Liam explained why he was heading to Buffalo, and Isaac understood. In fact, he suggested Liam take a few days off. Liam replied with little enthusiasm, "I'll see how things are in Buffalo and let you know what I decide." Liam sat down to eat at a small diner inside the gas station. He ordered coffee and the house breakfast, even though it was almost 3 p.m. He wasn't really hungry, but he knew he had a long way to go and needed to eat something. While waiting for his food, he thought about his childhood friends and neighbors, Tommy Bauman, Linda Barker, and Austin Chapman. He wondered about where life had taken them. Picking up his phone, he searched their names on Google, starting with Tommy. What he found piqued his curiosity and dread. Multiple news outlets referenced obituaries. Tommy had died 5 years ago under strange circumstances. Officially ruled a suicide, the medical reports mentioned mental illness. The same pattern emerged as he searched for his other childhood friends. Social media profiles were outdated, filled with old posts, or offered little to no information. The few that had any notable mentions often described disappearances or deaths under suspicious circumstances. This unsettling discovery worsened Liam's mood, and he barely touched his food. He finished his coffee and got back on the road. Despite the heavy feeling lingering in his chest, the remainder of the drive passed quickly. He arrived in Buffalo at around 6:30 p.m. Given the time of year, it was already nearly dark. He decided the best course of action was to go home, rest, and visit his mother at the nursing home the next day. He briefly thought about Barbara, but knew he couldn't contact her. The first days of rehabilitation were the hardest, requiring as much isolation as possible. Rest seemed like the best idea. His body craved it. When Liam parked his truck in front of the house, it took a lot of effort to get out of the car. A sudden gust of wind swept down the street, carrying with it the acrid smell of smoke. He paused, scanning the empty neighborhood, but no chimneys were lit and no fires burned. Overhead, the clouds churned in tight, swirling circles, and the air grew colder, not the crisp chill of December, but an invasive, bone-deep frost that seeped into his skin. He felt a growing heaviness in his body, fatigue in his eyes, and sharp headaches, symptoms of exhaustion that had worsened with every mile closer to his hometown. A neighbor Liam didn't recognize crossed the street to greet him. Introducing himself as Mr. Bill, the man explained that he had been living across the street for a couple of years and had been left with a spare set of keys to the house to give to Liam. Until then, Liam hadn't even thought about how he would get inside the house. Bill was kind and mentioned that he had been the one to find Barbara in her distressed state. He expressed his condolences but said he was glad to finally meet Liam. He even offered his house to spend Christmas with Liam and his mother if they didn't want to be alone. Liam thanked him for the gesture and took the opportunity to ask Bill about the other neighbors on the block. He had noticed upon arriving that most of the houses looked abandoned. Bill confirmed Liam's observation. He explained that since moving in, he'd barely met anyone aside from Barbara and Maggie. The rest of the neighborhood had been eerily quiet, so much so that his house was the only one decorated for Christmas. Bill mentioned he lived with his wife, and their children would be visiting in the coming days for the holidays. Otherwise, Buffalo seemed even more desolate than usual. As Bill walked back to his house, Liam stood there, looking at the street. Shadows began to warp and stretch unnaturally. Thick smoke seeped from the storm drains, and the streets were littered with debris, discarded toys, old newspapers, and twisted scraps of metal that looked untouched for decades. The sky darkened rapidly, and the clouds swirled with the beginnings of an electrical storm, almost as if a hurricane were on the horizon. The streetlights flickered erratically. Liam ran his hand over his face, and everything snapped back to normal. The exhaustion from the trip was weighing heavily on him. He couldn't help but feel nostalgic as he stepped onto the porch of his childhood home. Everything looked just as he had left it. It was his family home, and while it was clearly an older house, it was still in good condition. His sister hadn't spent all the money on drugs and alcohol after all. When he walked inside, he found a Christmas tree set up in the living room. Liam took a deep breath and let himself absorb the details of the old house, the family photos, the ornaments his mother had kept, and her favorite chair for watching TV. It was overwhelming. He walked over to the Christmas tree and noticed a photo placed in the center. He picked it up and saw it was of him and Barbara when they were kids, standing in that very same living room in front of a Christmas tree. Judging by the look of the photo, it must have been from 1998. As Liam took a closer look at the photograph, he noticed a strange blotch in the corner of the image. Upon closer inspection, it looked like a humanoid figure standing in the shadows behind the tree. He raised the photo to the light for a better look, and his heartbeat quickened. The more he studied it, the faster his heart raced. Lowering the photo, he glanced toward the same corner of the room and felt as though something was watching him. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and opened them again, only to find the room completely dark. Liam turned slowly, and in the silence, a massive silhouette shifted. He reached for his phone in his pocket, but it clumsily fell to the floor. Suddenly, he heard a whisper. It was Barbara's voice. "Welcome home." The sound of his phone vibrating startled Liam awake. He was lying on his back on the living room floor. Picking up his phone, he saw Isaac's name on the screen. Answering groggily, he said, "Hello?" Isaac immediately sensed it wasn't the best time. "Hey man, I was just calling to see if you were okay and if you made it there safely." Liam replied briefly, "All good, man. I think the drive wore me out. I passed out as soon as I got home." Isaac told him to rest and to let him know if he needed anything. At that moment, Liam couldn't tell if what had happened earlier was a dream or if it had really occurred. He had been so overwhelmed with thoughts since receiving the news that he dismissed it as irrelevant. He felt exhausted and knew he needed to rest. Still, it felt strange to be back and didn't want to sleep in his old room, so he opted to sleep on the couch in the living room sofa. The next morning, Liam woke up early and called the nursing home that had contacted him about his mother. The person who answered provided the exact address, which wasn't in Buffalo but in Casper, a small town on the outskirts of Buffalo. Apparently, Maggie had been sent there because all the nursing homes in Buffalo were abandoned. Liam plugged the address into Google. Central Wyoming Senior Services, 1 hour and 40 minutes away. He called and informed them that he would pick his mother up around 10 a.m. On his way, he grabbed a quick breakfast, and as promised, he arrived on time to pick up his mother. At first, she didn't recognize him, but after a moment, she realized Liam was her son. Maggie was in a wheelchair and didn't look bad physically. She spoke slowly but with conviction. Her eyes guided her words, which came out clearly, though occasionally her sentences were somewhat incoherent. Maggie was thrilled to see Liam, and even more so when he took her home. On the drive back, Liam had small conversations with his mother. She couldn't stop asking about Barbara. It was hard for him to explain why Barbara, who had been caring for her for 10 years, wasn't there. Liam told her that Barbara had taken a short vacation, but would return soon. Maggie smiled and said, "I'm glad, because lately, the Shadow Man has been bothering her." Liam immediately pulled the car over and turned toward his mother in the back seat. "What are you talking about?" he asked. Maggie shifted the topic abruptly, saying she was hungry and asking if they could stop for food. Liam didn't press the matter, but deep down, he already suspected that something wasn't right. As they neared Buffalo, Maggie began to show signs of weakness. Her eyes lost focus, and Liam, watching her through the rearview mirror, saw her arms fall limp, as though it was too much effort to keep them up. The smile she had shown when she recognized him earlier had faded, replaced by a vacant stare. Most concerning of all, she had stopped speaking entirely. Liam also felt the same heaviness return, the oppressive weight he had experienced the night before. When they arrived at the house, Liam mentioned to his mother that he had met Mr. Bill, the neighbor who had invited them to spend Christmas at his home. But Maggie said nothing in return. Curious, Liam glanced across the street at Mr. Bill's house and noticed that the Christmas decorations were gone. In fact, the house now looked run down and abandoned, its windows dark and lifeless. As soon as they entered the house and Liam shut the door, Maggie spoke again. "Mr. Bill didn't survive the Shadow Man." Liam froze, his hand still on the wheelchair. "Who is the Shadow Man?" he asked. But Maggie didn't reply. Instead, she raised a finger to her lips, signaling him to stay quiet. That was when Liam understood. Something was terribly wrong. As Liam wheeled Maggie into the living room, he noticed her breathing had become shallow and uneven. "I'm going to get you something to drink. I'll be right back," he said, his voice tight with unease. Maggie didn't respond. Her eyes, which had been lively with recognition earlier, now stared blankly at the floor. Liam hesitated for a moment before heading to the kitchen. From there, he kept glancing toward the living room, unable to shake the feeling that something was off. He heard a faint rustling sound, like dry leaves being stirred by the wind. Returning to the living room, he froze at the sight before him. Maggie sat unnaturally still in her wheelchair, her head tilted slightly to one side, as though she were listening to something unseen. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. "Mom?" Liam asked, taking a cautious step closer. She slowly turned her head to face him. Her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, her teeth bared in a way that didn't belong to her gentle demeanor. Then, in a voice that wasn't hers, she spoke. "It's too late to run now." Liam's chest tightened as panic set in. He rushed to her side, but before he could touch her, Maggie convulsed violently. Her head snapped back, her body arching in the chair, as if some unseen force was pulling her. Liam stumbled backward, watching in horror as her skin stretched over her bones like parchment. Her fingers clawed at the armrests of the wheelchair, her nails scraping deep gouges into the upholstery. Her breathing stopped, and the room fell silent. For a brief moment, it looked as if she had become a lifeless husk, her head slumped forward. Then, with a sickening creak, her head jerked up, and her hollow eyes met Liam's. A thin stream of black liquid trickled from the corners of her mouth. "Mom?" Liam whispered. His voice was barely audible. Without warning, she raised a trembling hand and pointed toward the far corner of the room. "He is here," she rasped, her voice faint and brittle. Her arm fell limp, and her body slumped lifelessly in the chair. Liam backed away. His phone rang. It was a local number he didn't recognize. Hesitantly, he answered, and Barbara's frantic voice came through. "Liam, you have to get out of there. Take Mom and leave." The call disconnected abruptly. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to thicken, coiling together like living tendrils. From within the darkness, a pair of unblinking eyes stared back at him. Panicked, Liam covered his ears, as if that could stop what was coming. From the shadows, a skeletal figure emerged. It was larger than Liam remembered, its elongated arms and legs moving in a slow, deliberate crawl. Its face was fixed, never moving with its body, and its unblinking eyes bore into Liam's mind. His heart raced as the terror transported him back to his childhood. He heard his mother's voice again. "Liam, it's time to leave." "Stop!" Liam screamed and bolted from the room. He flung open the front door and ran to his truck, fumbling with his keys in a panic. As he dropped them, he glanced behind him. The sky above the town was a hellish void. Lightning storms crackled across swirling black clouds, and the streets were pitch dark, with streetlights flickering sporadically. Scrambling into the truck, he started it and sped away, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. The creature had stepped into the middle of the street, its form growing larger and stronger with each step as it pursued him. Its massive shape loomed, and its pace quickened. As Liam drove, he noticed something chilling. The streets and buildings looked not just deserted, but abandoned for years. There was no sign of life, no traffic, no lights, just a ghost town consumed by decay. It was as if Buffalo had become an extension of the underworld. Desperate, Liam turned on the radio, hoping to hear news or a signal that might explain what was happening, but every station was static. His phone had no service. Then, without warning, the radio locked onto a station. Amidst the static, a raspy voice spoke. "Welcome home, Liam.